Welcome, everybody. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. We're just going to get started right after a few quick housekeeping items that I have for you. My name is Shirley Liu. I'm with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and I'm joined here today with Grace Huang, our policy director, who will be the presenter on the webinar today. I'll be in the background handling logistics and questions. Just a couple of things to note is that we are recording the webinar and it will be up on our website in about a week or less after the webinar. So you can feel free to check it out then or send it to your networks. We do have live captioning today. So you can, I think everybody is really familiar with Zoom at this point and knows how to set up the captioning and change the font sizes and all of that. If you're having an issue, just chat me in the chat and I can help you figure that out. And as Grace is speaking, feel free to leave your questions in the question and answer box, just so we can keep things organized. If you put it in the chat box, not a big deal. We can always help direct your questions to Grace. And also feel free to share any resources that your organization has or knows of. Any reflections or insights or anything like that. And with that, I will just go ahead and pass it over to Grace.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Shirley, and welcome everybody. As Shirley said, I'm Grace Huang. I'm the Director of Policy at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And we decided to do this webinar today because we get a lot of questions from advocates about how much they can participate in different types of advocacy, especially as it relates to legislative advocacy. And we also know that it's election season and people are always wondering how much they can do in that with that respect. And so this particular presentation today is focused a little bit on some of the rules specifically for 501c3 nonprofit organizations. Is not completely about that, but we're going to touch on that topic a little bit and how that relates to elections. And then we're also just going to talk about, how you actually do policy advocacy in the context of working with AA and HPI survivors. So let's see here. I think that the overview is we're going to talk about what policy advocacy means. And then we're going to talk a little bit about specific kinds of policy advocacy and legislative advocacy in particular. And then we'll talk a little bit about, what you can do during an election year or in the context of elections. And I do welcome questions, as Shirley said, in the Q&A, and I'm going to try to look at those as we go along. And if I don't happen to catch you because I am challenged by my multitasking, then you can raise your hand and remind me to look there. So why don't I get started? If Shirley, you don't mind moving to the next slide. So first, I'm going to just talk about what is policy advocacy. I have colleagues in my organization that are intimidated by that concept. It's like, well, I don't do policy. That's Grace's job. And I always say it's actually all of our job because it really is. And this definition comes from Jill Davies and her handbook that's put out through the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. But policy advocacy, another term for it could be systems advocacy. It has to do with, strategic efforts to improve systemic responses to survivors. And one of those, and so, survivors are going through all sorts of systems. I mean, even our own programs are systems, right? Domestic violence programs or sexual assault programs are systems. Law enforcement's a system. The courts are a system. The welfare office is a system. So when we talk about policy advocacy, it's related to everything we do. And I know that I have colleagues that not just at my organizations, but throughout, that are actually doing policy advocacy on a regular basis. They just don't think of it that way. And so the definition really speaks to being strategic and looking at how a system works, doing some planning and thought and analysis about it, and doing some effort to try to improve systemic responses to survivors. And so it can be ranging from training or curriculum development, depending on who you're talking about. Legislative is a specific type of effort, but it's not the only one. For those of you who work in courts, forms themselves have a policy impact, and improving forms like for protection orders or for the welfare office, et cetera. I mean, working on those can be policy efforts. All sorts of things can be policy efforts. And so I just want folks to think about that broadly when you're thinking about your work, and how, rather than just trying to fix, create a solution for one survivor or one family, anything that involves like trying to improve a systemic response can be policy advocacy. It's important to think about how that's integrated into the work of a domestic violence or sexual assault organization that isn't always accounted for well when we're responding to keeping track of grants and things like that. And but it's important work that should be integrated in all of our work. Next slide, please. So the hope is that the policy advocacy is driven by survivors of gender-based violence, and hopefully the work that we all do to try to improve systems is really focused on improving systems, and informed, if not led by, directly impacted survivors. And they often relate to helping survivors deal with not only the risks that are posed by their abuser or the perpetrator. It's like, yes, we want to improve systems that relate to how the abuser may cause physical or emotional harm. I mean, there's dealing with those systemic responses, but also addressing how abusers leverage other risks, like those generated by life, such as working on systems that relate to people's economic well-being or immigration status or language that they speak, all of those things that we want to think about dealing with life-generated risks. And that is a current conversation that's really going on right now as it relates to, for example, is law enforcement a safe place for people to call? Because in some communities, calling the police may create other risks for survivors, perhaps for immigration enforcement or physical harm, et cetera. And helping survivors in the whole spectrum of what they choose to do, whether they stay with their abusers or those who leave, and making sure that as we're doing advocacy, systems advocacy, that we're thinking about each survivor being unique, that solutions aren't one size fit all. And so when we're doing policy advocacy on behalf of survivors of gender-based violence, that it means all survivors and not, just those that have certain access to various systems. Okay, next slide. So what we're going to talk about is, how you actually do, systems advocacy or policy advocacy. And so these are, the general steps that people should be thinking about. And the first, of course, is to prepare, figuring out, how to advocate within that system that you're trying to change. Step 2 is analyzing the system's response to survivors. 3, planning and implementing policy advocacy. And what I mean by that will we'll talk about that in detail, but thinking about what specific actions you want to take, how you want to respond to that particular system. And we can think about different strategies. And then for if you've been effective in changing or monitoring the effects of current responses, and then if you're able to change systemic responses or policy responses, continued and ongoing analysis and advocacy, just making sure that that perhaps you didn't create more harm or you didn't leave folks out. And so those are important things to think about as you're working to decide on what strategies you want to pursue. So next slide, please. So first, how to prepare to advocate in the system. You really want to think about a whole range of things. And I, having done policy advocacy, I want to say, how long have I been doing? I've been doing it for about 20 some years now. And one of the things that I've done as an advocate, I've worked in state legislation and I've worked on federal legislation, as well as, a lot of administrative advocacy and court advocacy. And one of the things that always strikes me is people say, we just need to change the law. We need to change the law. And so the law, and that may be true, but in terms of figuring out, there's a lot of analysis that needs to go into like, what are the actual barriers to a survivor? And so what information do you already have or know about the subject? And one thing an example, let me give you one. I think most of us, if you're a survivor advocate that works with domestic violence survivors that are going through the court system, I'm thinking of civil court, for example, we continue on a regular basis to hear from advocates that courts do a really poor job in child custody decisions. And so, that's an area where we hear we need to change the law. We need to make it so, judges really understand what, that the law needs to tell judges not to award child custody to abusers, for example. And the question is, in that instance is like, folks want to go change the law. And the question is like, well, is it actually the law that needs to be changed, or is it something else? And so some of the things I list on this slide for you to think about is like, so what information do you have? What does the law actually say? What other information do you need about it? Is it, are judges being driven to make the decisions they do because it's the law that's influencing that? Or is it more about people aren't able to present their cases? Or is it because they need more training? Is it because there's not enough funding for there to be, thorough investigations of what's happening in child custody cases? How do you figure out the kind of information that you need to be able to decide, okay, this is how we're going to influence this particular system? And as somebody who has done legislative advocacy, for example, for many years, that's one route that people can take. But then you need to figure out, okay, so if we're going to go through that path, what information do we need to know about that? Like, what drives the ability for you to get a law passed to change that? Who are the other stakeholders that are engaged in that system? Who else has a stake? And so, for example, if you're going to go through the, advocating to change the court system, who else is lobbying in the legislature? Is the judges, do they have a union? Do they have a decision, have some leeway in there? Are there groups that are advocating on behalf of, non-custodial parents? Are there groups that are advocating on behalf of the family law attorneys? Is the reason that, the system doesn't work the way that it does, that you want it to, because there's not enough resources for people to get legal representation to be able to present their case? And so there just is a lot of preparation that should happen in terms of deciding what people want to do to advocate in the system. And I always recommend like gathering as much of that information as possible before starting or deciding that you're going to go down a particular path. Sometimes it just needs to be, the law needs to change, but okay, next slide, please. So the next is, yes, analyzing specifically the systemic response. List, choose what aspect it is that you're looking to change. And so I can give you another example right now of something that we've all been working on. In particular, one of the things that we work on is access to public benefits for Asian and Pacific Islander survivors, right? And so you go to the welfare office with a survivor, and they are seeking benefits, but they are told they're not eligible. And so, or maybe in your community, survivors, API survivors don't have access to benefits. And so often I'm told by advocates, for example, when I'm doing technical assistance, we have a challenge that like the survivors we work with, aren't, they can't get, some of the federally funded programs. And so one of the things we want to do is actually, figure out is that, what's going on, what's the status of that system in terms of providing access. And so you'll want to think about that component, like what is it that's driving that? And so it might be, is it the federal law that impacts that? Is it the state law that impacts that? Is it because people have, not very good information about what the rules are? Is it because the welfare office itself doesn't know what the law is, et cetera? And so figure out, and there's different ways to gather that information, but really looking at, what you need to do to actually impact this particular system. And so I have a question in the chat about whether or not federally funded nonprofits can go in this process. We're going to cover that topic as we go along. So there will be more information about that. In any event, let's see here. We'll want to think about when we're pushing for a strategy, are there potential negative effects if you go one way or another? I mean, I know there's a lot of effort right now, for example, to, a lot of debate and a lot of effort right now in our field overall, thinking about, how much we've invested as a field in the law enforcement response. And so, what we're hearing from many communities, of course, over time has been, there have been some positive effects and there have been some negative effects. And so the question is, what do we do to address those negative effects, and who are those negative effects actually impacting? And so in terms of deciding what you want to do next, figuring out what efforts that you engage in, how likely it is you're going to be able to increase options for survivors, and give folks the ability to make decisions about their life, as well as reducing the control of their abuser. Next slide, please. This is one of those fields or those areas in doing policy advocacy where we often bump up against the challenges of negative effects. One of the things that I regularly work on is, for example, in the immigration world, people, in the child welfare world or whatever, is let's create a solution that lets survivors have a special perk or a special benefit or a special program. And sometimes that's a great thing. But then in thinking through that, are there survivors who are left out? And what we have found over the years, for example, is that when we create a special program specifically for survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault or whomever, the folks that are left out, because they're not able to show that they meet the qualifications for this particular program or benefit, how does that impact them? And sometimes when you make a change in a policy, you got to think about the inverse of like, so you created this special program for survivors. What does that mean for everybody else that wasn't included in that fix? And so one really particular example that I have is like in immigration. People get put into deportation proceedings and there's a special opt-out, exception for domestic violence survivors in that particular program. And so, but then what that means is everybody else that doesn't actually fit that narrow criteria, the law is interpreted to say they're not, eligible for certain protections. And so that's always something that we are regularly reminding our colleagues of as they're pushing forth policy solutions as it relates to domestic violence or sexual assault in whichever system. So next slide, please. So as you go into doing planning and implementation of your strategy for policy advocacy, what is it you're ultimately trying to accomplish? Are there, various options available? And so, one of the things that I was talking about earlier are the options. Right now, for example, in Congress, it's really hard to get legislation passed. And yeah, trying to get legislation passed, when you're doing that, you got to think about like how high of a priority can you make Congress, think about something, and who are all the other interests. And so the reality is like many advocates have decided, okay, like legislation at the federal level might not be the solution, but are there other options we can do? And so folks are thinking about, okay, maybe we do administrative policy advocacy and you work with the executive branch or the agency that's responsible for implementing this particular thing. Or you decide, okay, maybe litigation and lawsuits and suing the government might be another option. And so as people are thinking about trying to do systems change, these are some of the questions that you really need to think through. It's like, maybe you do it all together, and what's the sequence for activity? So one of the things that's very present right now, for example, is the public charge rule for immigration, the rule that says that people, might be ineligible to immigrate if if they're likely to become dependent on the government. And the advocates in that community, have for years tried to work on legislation eliminating that in the law, but have been unable to do that. So other strategies have been, okay, engaging in the rulemaking process, submitting lots of written comments to the federal agency that administers it, organizing the community to gather information, to do research, to document all of the things that are happening in the community, and to seek accesses and resources to, seeking funding from foundations and others to support that work, doing lots of community education, and also litigation. I mean, certainly in the last administration, there was a lot of work on that. So, and I have to say in that particular instance, there was a lot of coordination about, okay, we are going to work on rulemaking. We're going to submit hundreds of thousands of comments. When the rule gets passed, there's litigation filed. So, I mean, there's a lot of, that particular concept or that set of policies was one where, you could see all the different things that were happening that relate to this very question of the planning and implementation, and all sorts of efforts went into that policy advocacy. Next slide. And then monitoring effects. That's the next thing that you want to do. Let's say you get a policy change. Is it actually being helpful, or is it the system not being helpful, and why not? So this has been my experience over the years. It's like we get a law passed and really nothing changes. And partly it's because, okay, in order to implement it well, what else needs to happen? Okay, we need to go train the judges. I mean, or we need to make sure that there's a new form that's put together, learn again from the system about, like, just because you got the policy change at one level, is that actually enough? And so knowing that there are multiple pieces of changing policy is important, so that as you're working on that, to be able to plan for not just actually changing the written policy, but actually monitoring it and figuring out what next needs to happen in order for it to be implemented. So we got this question earlier. Next slide. A particular form of advocacy, and this goes to the question about whether or not nonprofits can be engaged in lobbying. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time to talk about what does lobbying actually mean, and who can you do it, can you not do it, etc. So next slide. Remember that advocacy means that you're engaged in supporting a cause or proposal. You're in the process of advocating or supporting or arguing for something. And that's, a dictionary definition. So lobbying is a form of advocacy, but it's very specific and it's defined in the law. And so the federal law says lobbying is communication that's intended to influence specific legislation. So, whether it be at the city council or your state legislature or in Congress, it's a bill or a policy proposal that's moving through a legislative body. So legislation is an action by a legislative body such as Congress or a state legislature or a city council or a similar body with respect to acts, bills, resolutions, or similar items, or possibly by, in some states, you've got a referendum or a ballot initiative or a constitutional amendment that are voted on by the people. But it's something that is voted on by a government body. And so I want you to be aware of this very specific definition of lobbying. It has to do with, a piece of legislation or a bill. It's not generally educating policymakers about how policies impact your constituency. It's not, only if you're talking about a specific bill are you lobbying. So next slide, please. Here's what the rules say, that nonprofit organizations, yes, they can lobby, they can engage in legislative advocacy. Now, I want you to be very clear about the fact you're allowed to lobby. You're just not allowed to use federal funding, any federal grants that you get in order to pay for the time or the activities to do that. So this question from Luana in the comments is like, federally funded nonprofit can lobby. The question is, how is your nonprofit funded? Do you have any funding that's not federal grants? I mean, if you have zero non-federal, if you have zero funds for your organization that are not government, okay, let me say this again. If you don't have any funding that's not government funding, then you won't be able to, as a nonprofit, to be able to lobby. You would be able to lobby on your own time. You could volunteer to do that, but you can't use government dollars to support lobbying activities. Now, lots of organizations have other funds, private donations, foundation funds, etc., in which that they can use to support lobbying activities. And that's the thing, is that I want to make sure people understand you cannot lobby with federal funds, but nonprofits, even if they get federal funding, are allowed to lobby. What happens is that the law says that 501c3s can only spend not a substantial part of their activities that to attempt to influence legislation. For example, let's say your organization, and I'm just going to round to easy numbers, like, okay, let's say you have a budget of $100,000 a year for your program. And you have, maybe $10,000 of that is not government money. You've gotten a bunch of donations right? You've got $100,000 overall, and maybe you spend, an hour or 2 or 3 a week lobbying. And the question is whether that means it's not a substantial part of your activities. And so it's not a clear line. So many organizations, they elect instead to use the 501H expenditure test, and that involves filing a form with the IRS saying that we're opting for under 501H to get a clear defined percentage amount of our overall budget to decide that we can lobby with that money. And so the question is just like, what part of your organizational budget is available for lobbying activities? And then, if you want more clarity in deciding, how much time you can spend, some people or some organizations file for this 501H expenditure test. So, I mean, for large organizations, for example, multi-million-dollar organizations, that like have a tiny program, it's, it might more easily be considered not a substantial part of their activities are involved in attempting to influence legislation. But others, are going to want a more specific, like clear line number. So the question in the chat, some grants specify not engaged in political activities. Now I'm going to get to that question in a little bit. Political activities and lobbying are 2 different things. Next slide, please. In terms of types of lobbying, there are 2 types of lobbying. Direct lobbying is, communicating with a legislator or an employee of the legislative body that speaks to a specific piece of legislation and expresses a view on that legislation. So, for example, contacting your city council member about initiative or an ordinance that they have going on about funding for domestic violence programs. And if you call your city council member and say, we support that bill or that ordinance because it would, support or help victims in our community. If you're talking about a specific thing that's moving through that legislative body, that's considered direct lobbying. Now, generally, if you were to be saying to a legislator and they're not actually working on an ordinance or a bill going through their process, and you were talking about, we serve lots of survivors and these are some of the challenges they face, and these are some of the systemic problems, like talking to my city council member about the survivors we work with, they don't have access to resources because none of the services are available in the language that they speak. And so our program has to go into the system on a regular basis and provide interpretation when we're not, like educating legislators. Just because you're talking to a legislator doesn't mean you're lobbying. I mean, if you're doing general education, that's not lobbying. But if you're speaking to, yes, there's a bill going through this process, we want you to increase the amount of money, or we want you to pass this bill, or we want you to oppose this bill because, it impacts us in this way, that's going to be considered direct lobbying. And then there's grassroots lobbying, trying to encourage the public to contact legislators about that legislation. Again, it has to relate to a specific piece of legislation, a bill, and reflect a view on that, and encourage the recipient of communication to actually take a step. So sending out an email to everybody saying, oh, there's this bill going through, Congress, and it would increase funds for direct services programs that serve immigrant victims, just letting people know that that's there, but not telling people to actually take a step to do something about that. Then you don't step into the line, over the line of what constitutes lobbying. And so I don't know if any of you have ever noticed that you're on, webinars or trainings, and people say there's this bill out there, and but people don't tell you what to do about it. It's because they don't want to like go over the line and to engage in grassroots lobbying. So, so lobbying again relates to a specific piece of legislation or a bill or something that's moving through a legislative process. And so it's important to know exactly what the definition of lobbying is. It's because you're not allowed to lobby with federal funds, for example, and then you also need to keep track of how much time is being spent on that. I want to say, next slide. There's, legislative advocacy really does, it's important, I think, for organizations, to the extent that they can, to support advocates in terms of being able to engage in legislative advocacy. You all have a lot of information about how policies impact the survivors that our organizations that are, that AAPI survivors, how they're impacted by various policies. And so, we don't necessarily have a lot of resources to be able to pay high paid lobbyists to be taking legislators to lunch and all of those things. But we have lots of stories and information about how policies impact people. And I will say, as somebody who does policy advocacy on a regular basis, that having information about what's happening on the ground, it's really important to have those stories, or that information from the field to be able to impact what's going on. And I will also say that my experience is, I know that most legislators, I'm not going to say all of them, really want to know what's happening with their constituents. They want to be able to say, I'm actually helping people in my district, and having stories and real life impacts of some of the bills they work on is really important. So next slide. Some of the things that we do, like I said earlier, are not lobbying. For example, nonpartisan analysis, study, or research that describes the impacts of policies on individuals or organizations is not lobbying. So, I mean, this is a great little flow chart that I think is helpful if you want to think about doing more policy advocacy in your organization and figure out, how much time and resources are we spending on lobbying. These are the it's kind of a flow chart going, yes, this is lobbying, this is not lobbying. So you will be getting the slideshows, but I really love this graphic. And just as a flag in the footnote there's a great, if you Google this particular document, this is where this graphic comes from, but in terms of having a resource available for you, that's there. So next slide, please. One thing I know that people also get concerned about, and it's more the second one, we already talked about, examinations or discussion of broad social problems generally, that's not about specific legislation, that's not going to be lobbying. Also, sometimes legislators will call our organizations or our programs, or your city council member or your state legislator or your congressional member may call you or ask you for specific technical advice or assistance. Now, if you are responding to them, a legislative body, is asking you for information, and you send that information to the entire legislative body, you send a general letter that talks about, the impact of a particular, maybe bill they're working on and how that impacts your constituent, responding to everybody, in that legislative body, like sending a general letter about, language that looks like this is how it would impact our constituents. If it's not only to a single legislator, and it's in writing, that is not going to necessarily be considered, that's not going to be considered lobbying. Also, defending, protecting your own organization, self-defense communications, like if there's a bill going through your city council or ordinance going through that like eliminates all the funding for victim services programs, for example, and you're in there talking about talking to legislators about, okay, if you eliminate that funding, that eliminates the existence of our organization or whatever, that kind of work is actually not considered lobbying as well. Now, if you, send out an email to all your supporters and say, everybody call in and say, like tell your legislator not to cut that funding, that would be considered lobbying. But if you yourselves are communicating as an organization and explaining the impact of something they're working on, and it would, that relates to the very existence of your organization, that would not be considered lobbying. So all of this to say, again, legislative activity or lobbying is important for nonprofits to engage on. So next slide, please. For those of you who are, maybe you don't have any funding to do lobbying, or maybe, you're figuring out, is this the best way to go? Maybe you don't have a lot of resources to do lobbying as an organization. Maybe there are other things that you have a lot of information to do, and you can do policy advocacy in other ways. I mean, is it best addressed through legislation? I mean, there are some things that have to be done through legislation, but sometimes it's not the legislation. Are other options available, like, working on, getting funding, or, I mean, if you're advocating for like a funding legislation, that's going to be lobbying. But in terms of, working with agencies to increase, allocate their funding differently, that wouldn't necessarily be considered lobbying. Or, should we be working on training or community? Whoops, community is in there twice. Education, is that enough? These are things to think about before or as you're engaging in lobbying work or legislative work, and deciding how much energy you want to put in there into doing the work. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now this is responds to the question, I think, that's in the chat as to Grant specifically saying not engaging in political activities. And so this is, next slide, please. What about election-related activities? Nonprofits may not participate in partisan political activity. So this, and as we're coming into election season, this is something that folks need to be careful to think about, which is you can work on the issues, you can work on advancing the issues, but you cannot support a political a campaign for, you can't support a candidate or on support or oppose a candidate as a nonprofit organization. So this is the law itself. 501c3 organization may not intervene in any political campaign on behalf or in opposition to a candidate for public office. Next slide, please. So you can't endorse a candidate or support a political party. You can't donate money or resources to a candidate or a party. And you can't engage in any, partisan election-related activity. Next slide, please. But you can promote voter registration opportunities and inform people about their right or their ability to engage in the political process by voting. And you can conduct voter registration drives. You can also, next slide, remind folks of when deadlines are coming up, provide information about where and when to vote, what processes there are to register to vote. And for those of you, that have, for example, special address confidentiality laws, I think it's really important for victim advocacy organizations to be engaged in partnering with others that are working on voter registration to make sure that everybody's informed about how to vote, register to vote in safe ways for survivors who may have concerns about registering to vote and having their potential addresses become public as part of that process. I really would encourage those of you, encourage you to learn more about how you do that in your state or in your community, and then partner with others that are really actively registering folks to vote. The next slide, please. There are other things you're allowed to do. Sorry, next slide. In terms of getting out the vote that are allowed. I mean, these are not about a political candidate, right? So you're allowed to make put up information about the fact that elections are coming. You can support voters in getting to the polls, or giving information about how to actually vote themselves, or register for mail-in voting, for example. You can engage in, get out the vote phoning and text banks, and reminding your own colleagues, your staff, constituents to actually vote in your everyday communications, etc. Next slide. I mentioned this earlier, thinking about, as you're doing all of this, also educating your community and survivors about how, what information about them is out there if they're registered to vote, because your state's going to have different laws about who has access to voter registration information, how, all of this information, ways that your state address confidentiality program may allow for alternative registration. Also, in doing safety planning with survivors you're working with, having them think through whether, it's safe for them, because in some states, voter information is all compiled by data brokers, actually in a lot of states. And so thinking about how they may or may not be able to keep that out of some of these data broker databases, and thinking through with survivors risks of actually in-person voting. If you're going to be standing in line for hours, what risks that may pose. Working with survivors about possibly registering to vote by mail, etc. So those are things that victim advocacy organizations are going to want to think about doing. And then next slide, next two slides, actually. Surely, okay. Next one after this. So in terms of, as it is an election year, you can actually interact with people that are running for office. You just cannot take a position to say you're supporting one person or another, a candidate. And so a lot of nonprofits actually engage with candidates. You can actually talk to candidates about the needs of your constituents, about the unique needs that they have. It's important, actually, for our organizations to develop these relationships over time, because we want them to make sure they know we're in the community and that we're representing constituency, but you just got to be really careful that if you're doing that with one candidate, that you're doing that with, you make yourself available for other candidates as well. You got to be very clear that you're not being partisan. If you have candidates, for example, that work with your organization on a regular basis, you have to make sure that you make sure they're appearing as individuals in the community and not candidates. And so that's always a tricky line to walk, but in terms of being very clear with candidates, if they're engaging with your organization, that they're doing that, not in the context of running for office. Some nonprofits actually put together debates and forums, voter forums, and you can do that. You just have to make sure that your organization is clear that all candidates, who are, all viable candidates that are seeking that office have the equal opportunity to participate in your forums, and then reminding the audience and the candidates on a regular basis explicitly that the event is nonpartisan. Next slide. You can have forums that cover a whole range of issues and topics, and making sure that they have the opportunity to speak or give their opinions about the topics being discussed. I think it's safer as a nonprofit, if you're engaged in this, that it not only cover one topic, that it's very clear that one candidate has one position and the other candidate has another position, and you're working on a specific topic that you want to be very careful about making sure that you're not providing a forum to make it clear, like obvious, that you're supporting one candidate versus another. And so those are just things to consider if you're working with others in the community about putting together candidate forums. I know that a lot of organizations work maybe in a coalition with others that are similar, so that they can have candidates come and talk to folks and educate them about like their positions on a range of issues and not just one or two. And you can also do voter guides and questionnaires for the candidates, asking them a range of questions and letting folks know like what positions candidates may be taking. But again, you got to be very clear that if you're putting together these kinds of materials for the field, that they are, or for your community, that that you're not signaling that you're supporting in some way one candidate over the other. So those are just some tips. Oh, next slide. I'm sorry. I moved on and yeah, just being really very clear about that you're talking about issues and having them express your opinion, their opinions on various issues, but you as an organization keeping your opinions out, just presenting what it is that they articulate as their, what they plan to do on any particular topic. And I think it's really important in this day and age, especially as we're working with survivors, to learn what candidates know, or what their experience is in working with survivors from our communities, particularly what their experience is working with Asian and Pacific Islander communities or immigrant communities or survivors specifically. It's really helpful to have that information for all of us to be able to make informed decisions as individuals on, who is going to be supportive of our constituency. Next slide. So here's another question about ballot measures. These are on the, they are essentially a piece of legislation, and nonprofits, just like you can lobby a legislature to support or oppose a piece of legislation moving through, you can actually take positions on ballot measures. And so if you're doing work on supporting an initiative or a referendum, that would be considered lobbying. You're working to influence passage or defeat of a law. And so then you need to document the amount of time that's being spent, and you can't, of course, spend, your government funding to work on ballot measures. But you also want to be really careful about the connection between particular ballot measures and candidates who are running for office. And so you don't want to be seen as partisan in terms of if you're working really hard to support. I mean, I think the big thing these days is what climate change, for example, and if your organization, I mean, I don't know if any of our but let's say if you were a nonprofit organization working in the world of climate change, and there's a clear divide between the parties, at least in terms of who supports certain types of legislation or not. And you just want to be very careful if you're working on ballot measures or referenda, that that work that you do in terms of supporting that or not is not seen as partisan in terms of activities related to candidates who are running as well. So next slide. So what can nonprofit staff do? So, I mean, this is only using agency resources, but staff themselves can do whatever they want as it relates to election activities, partisan political activity on their own time. They can volunteer on campaigns, they can go to political events and rallies, they can donate, whatever, can even run for office on their own time, not on nonprofit time, not on your staff time. And you can do it on your vacation hours, outside work hours, you can take time off. You got to be very careful about using your nonprofit resources, making sure they're not being used for partisan political activities, including, your phones, your laptops, your printers. And so I just want to flag this area, being very, very careful. I know that, a lot of candidates know me from the work that I've done over the years. And so I regularly get emails to my work address, and I say, do not, so I'll respond. It's like, don't use this email address. Here's if you want to contact me about campaigns, you got to send it to my personal email address. Being really careful about that. Same thing, texting or phone calls, all of that, just being very careful about not doing electioneering related work on your nonprofit organization's resources. Also being careful about using your social media accounts as nonprofit organizations, being clear that you're not supporting or opposing candidates on your electronic, on your Facebook or Twitter or whatever. So also being careful about, a lot of candidates will ask their friends, and some of us have friends that are running for office. You got to be careful if they're asking us for endorsements, to be not linking any endorsements or, wearing, buttons or campaign related apparel or whatever when you are out in the community, representing your nonprofit organization. So being really careful about that. And then it'd probably be best practice if you've got a leadership position in a nonprofit and you're regularly seen as representing a nonprofit, that you go, if you're going to campaign events doing endorsements, to be very clear that you're doing it in your personal capacity and not representing your organization. Next slide. So, these are a whole bunch of resources that I highly recommend if you, just so that you can learn more about lobbying and what lobbying actually means, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, and resources for, working with survivors specifically, and safety planning as it relates to voter registration and engaging in registering to vote and voting itself. And so, I encourage you to take a look at some of these resources to learn more information. And we also at the Institute, I'm happy to take any, direct questions if you have them. And here, let me put my information. realized I didn't actually put my contact information on the slides, but I'm putting it in the chat right now if you have more questions about it. But essentially, the goal of this, in summary, I just want to encourage all of you to engage in systems advocacy and policy advocacy, and remember that lobbying is just a sliver of policy advocacy, that you all have a lot of expertise about how systems impact the survivors you work with. And your input and your expertise and their stories, sharing information about how they can engage in the process themselves, the survivors you work with, is really important. And engaging in also, voting and the election process, not on work time, is important. I mean, in terms of supporting candidates, that is, but learning about how to vote and learning about the candidates is really important. So, I mean, I think that's it for my presentation. I don't know if anybody has any more questions beyond what was in the chat. I think this was the length of our. thing. So we just have a few more minutes, or finish half an hour early, which is great, unless anybody has other questions. And I'm hoping, did I answer the questions that you had that were in the chat? Or is everything crystal clear now? Okay.
Grace, I think you did such a good job of presenting that there's no questions remaining from anybody.
Yeah.
It seems like.
I mean, I think, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the most important, I think, thing with respect to the questions that I got, the two in particular, is yes, nonprofits can lobby. You can't use government funds to do it. And of course, you're going to want to look at how your programs are funded. If you have grant conditions that say no, you can't lobby or engage in political activity, which is more about electioneering, you just want to be very clear with your funders around their rules about what you're allowed to do with their funding. But and the resources that we had on that last slide there can help you figure out, like, you do need to document time that is spent on lobbying, and that lobbying activity has to be reported to the IRS when folks are doing their reporting each year as a nonprofit. And so there is that aspect of administrative aspect of the work. But as a national resource center that engages in policy advocacy, a whole spectrum from administrative to court to legislative advocacy, I mean, I just think it's so important for all of you that are working directly with impacted folks to be engaged in the process. So that's it. That's all I got. Okay. Oh, question in the chat. What happens if someone accuses your organization of lobbying? How to respond to that? This is why it's really important to be documenting time. I guess the question that I'm asked, that I have, is like, so what if somebody accuses your organization of lobbying? I mean, that's a permissible activity for nonprofits. The question is whether they've accused your organization of lobbying with funds that are not allowed, you're not allowed to use for lobbying. I mean, certainly what we want to be careful about is, if we are engaged in lobbying, making sure that we've documented that it's either not on work time, or that we have funds to pay staff or pay folks, funds that are not restricted funds. And so if you've got that documented, certainly you can demonstrate that it wasn't paid for out of government funds. Then there's that piece of it. But I would look at the resources that I had on the last slide that you'll be getting in terms of figuring out like what steps you really need to take. And so just even as a nonprofit ourselves at the Institute, like we need to be careful, of course, you know, anytime that we spend, you know, sending an email out to people to vote, you know, like urge them to call their member of Congress, or any time that we spend on social media, we have to document that time as lobbying time, and it needs to be billed that way so that we are careful about the time that we spend doing that. And it's just something that organizationally, you know, the management needs to make sure that they have the resources to actually support staff to do that if that's part of the work plan, or be very clear with your overall organizations, like that if they want to do lobbying, that's got to be, you know, off of work time. So, but you know, lobbying in itself is not a bad thing. I mean, lobbying is just taking a position on, you know, asking a lawmaker to take a position on a piece of legislation going through. It's like, yeah, we need to change laws to make them better, to support survivors. So that would be my response, I guess, if you have the resources to do it. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. So yeah, engage in the process, get people registered to vote, help them get informed about who the candidates are and what their positions are. I think that's it.
Seems like there's no additional questions. If you do have any, Grace had left her email in the chat, so feel free to get in touch with her. I'm going to drop a post-webinar survey link. If you could help us kind of fill out, give us your feedback on this webinar today, that would be really helpful in our future events. And I just want to thank everybody for being here and Grace for presenting today.
And check out the resources.
We'll send the slides out to everybody afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.